A 729-foot freighter vanished in 10 minutes, no distress call. 29 men aboard. 17 miles from shelter, not one body was ever recovered. This is Lake Superior, the largest freshwater surface on Earth, with 350 miles of open water for the wind to work on. The easy answer is November storms and waves measured at 28 feet. Waves explain a sinking. They do not explain the silence or the missing dead. The real system is the shape of the water, its temperature, and the distance to help. In 1905, 1913, 1927, 1975, 2017, the technology changed. The mechanism did not. Start with the shape, because the shape is the first problem and almost nobody thinks about it. Superior is not a round lake. It is a long, narrow trough gouged out of the continent, running roughly west-northwest to east-southeast, about 350 miles from the harbor at Duluth to the outlet at the eastern end. That axis matters more than the size. In autumn, the dominant storm winds across the upper Midwest blow from the west-northwest. Line up a compass rose with a chart of the lake, and you find something that should not be comfortable for anybody who works out there. The prevailing autumn wind and the long axis of the lake point in almost exactly the same direction. That alignment is what engineers call fetch. Fetch is simply the uninterrupted distance over which wind can push on water. Every mile of open water lets the wind hand a little more energy to the surface, and the surface has nowhere to put that energy except into waves that get taller, longer, and faster. On a small lake, the fetch runs out after a few miles, and the water can only build so far. On Superior, a west-northwest gale can push across nearly the entire length of the lake without touching land. There is nothing to interrupt it. No island chain across the middle, no barrier reef, no shoal ridge to trip the waves and bleed them down. The wind gets 300 miles of runway, and the water at the far end pays for all of it. Now put a person in that geometry, not a statistic. A wheelsman standing a 4-hour watch in a steel pilot house, holding a course by compass, with a load of iron ore underneath him and a schedule in the captain's head. The eastern end of that 300-mile runway is exactly where he has to go, because the ore has to reach the steel mills, and the only way out of Lake Superior is through the locks at Sault Ste. Marie, at the far southeastern corner. Every loaded ore carrier in the lake is trying to reach the same funnel. The wind knows the way too. There's only one significant piece of land that sticks out far enough to break that runway. The Keweenaw Peninsula, a long finger of ancient copper-bearing rock, reaches up from the Michigan shore into the middle of the lake. In a northwest gale, the lee side of the Keweenaw is the only place in the open lake where a ship can put land between itself and the wind and get a few hours of manageable water. It is not a harbor, it is a shadow. Captains have run for that shadow for 150 years, and later in this story you will watch a 545-foot steel freighter turn toward it and never arrive. The other refuge is Whitefish Bay, the shallow pocket at the southeastern end, tucked behind Whitefish Point, where ships gather before they thread into the St. Mary's River and down to the locks. It is the only real shelter for roughly 100 miles of that eastern coast. Hold on to that fact, because there is something wrong with it, and the wrongness is not obvious until you understand what shallow water does to a wave. Whitefish Bay is the safest place on that end of the lake, and also some of the shallowest water a loaded freighter will cross all season. Those two things are not a coincidence. They are the same fact wearing two faces, and it will take 4 disasters and 70 years before this story can show you why. The numbers people quote about Superior are usually the impressive ones. Roughly 31,700 square miles of surface, larger than any other freshwater lake on the planet by area. Around 2,900 cubic miles of water, close to a tenth of the fresh surface water on Earth. A maximum sounded depth of 1,332 feet. Enough water that if you drained it across the two Americas, It would cover both continents a foot deep. Those numbers are true, and they are also useless to a crew. A sailor does not drown in 31,700 square miles. He drowns in the 50 feet between a tilting deck and a lifeboat David that will not swing out because the ship is already listing the wrong way. So, translate the numbers into something a body can feel. The depth first. A maximum of 132 feet means that most of these wrecks are permanently out of reach of any ordinary recovery. The Edmund Fitzgerald lies in about 530 feet of water. That is not deep by ocean standards, and it is far too deep for a diver on air. It took submersibles and remotely operated vehicles to even photograph her. The Henry B. Smith sat at roughly 535 feet for 99 years before anyone found her at all, in a lake you can stand on the shore of and see weather coming across. Depth here does not mean mystery in the romantic sense. It means that when a ship goes down, the evidence goes with it, and the arguments about what happened get to run for decades without anything to settle them. The temperature is the number that actually kills. Below the seasonal thermocline, Superior sits near 4 degrees Celsius, about 39 Fahrenheit, essentially all year. Freshwater reaches its maximum density at 4 degrees, so the coldest, densest water sinks and stays there. And the lake is so large and so deep that summer sun barely scratches it. In late autumn, when the storms come, the surface has cooled toward that same figure. A man going into that water is not going into cold water in the way a swimmer understands it. He is going into water cold enough to take his breathing away from him in the first 30 seconds, whether or not he is a strong swimmer, whether or not he is wearing a life jacket, whether or not the shore is close enough to see. Keep that in your head. It explains a frozen deck in 1905, and it explains 29 men who were never found in 1975, and it is the reason this lake has a reputation for keeping people that has nothing to do with legend and everything to do with physics. But the wave is the mechanism that starts everything, and the wave on Superior is a strange animal. Everyone assumes a big lake makes small ocean waves. That is roughly backwards. And the difference is the single most important technical idea in this entire story, so it is worth getting right, because it is not complicated once you see it. A wave has a height, which is what people photograph, and it has a period, which is what actually matters to a ship. The period is the time between one crest passing and the next. Out on the open Atlantic or Pacific, a mature storm swell has traveled thousands of miles, and the long waves outrun the short ones and sort themselves out. Ocean swell commonly arrives with a period of 12, 14, 16 seconds. The distance between crests, the wavelength, follows the period directly. At 14 seconds, the crests are about 1,000 feet apart. On Superior, the wind runs out of lake before the waves ever get that chance. The sea builds fast and hard under a violent local storm and then hits the far shore. Measured wave periods in a serious Superior gale typically run around 8 to 10 seconds. At 9 seconds, the crests are roughly 400 feet apart. At 8 seconds, closer to 330. Now put a ship in it. A 729-foot ore carrier meeting ocean swell with a 1,000-foot wavelength sits inside a single wave. The whole hull rises, the whole hull falls, and the water supports her along her full length while she does it. That is uncomfortable. It is not structurally dangerous. Put the same 729-foot hull into 400-foot Superior seas, and the geometry changes into something the ship was never asked to survive. She now spans nearly 2 full waves at once. That means she can be lifted at the bow and lifted at the stern with a trough sitting under her middle. So the center of the ship is trying to fall into a hole with 26,000 tons of iron ore pushing down on it. Naval architects call that sagging. Seconds later, the pattern inverts. A crest arrives amidships and lifts her middle while both ends hang unsupported over empty water, with the weight of the bow and the stern trying to break her back downward across the top of the wave. That is hogging. Sag, hog. sag, hog. Not once, every 8 to 10 seconds, hour after hour through an entire night in a hull the length of 2 football fields with thousands of tons of dead weight in her belly. The ocean tests a ship's stability. Superior tests a ship's spine. There is a second consequence, the one that puts water on deck. Steepness is the ratio of a wave's height to its length. A 25-foot wave stretched over 1,000 feet is a gentle hill. The same 25 feet packed into 400 feet is a wall. Water breaks when that ratio gets too extreme, and short, steep, breaking crests do not lift a ship. They hit her. They arrive before she is finished recovering from the last one, so the bow is still buried and still coming up when the next crest lands on top of it, and now solid green water is running the full length of the spar deck, at the speed of a car, tearing at hatch clamps, vents, railings, and anything a man might be holding. That is the first hard fact this lake teaches, and it took the industry the better part of a century to accept it. On Lake Superior, length is not safety. Length is exposure. The bigger the ship, the more waves she is forced to straddle at once, and the more the sea can work her like a bar bent back and forth until the metal gives up. Every ship named here was, in its own era, one of the largest and most modern vessels on fresh water. Not one of them was too big to be hurt. Several of them were, in a very specific structural sense, too big to be safe. Which raises the obvious question, the one that opens the human half of all this. If the geometry is that hostile in a west-northwest autumn gale, and it has been that hostile for the entire 10,000 years since the ice sheet carved this basin, then why does anyone cross the middle of it in November at all? The people who lived on these shores first had an answer. They did not cross it. The Anishinaabe, the Ojibwe people whose homeland surrounds this basin, and who call the lake Anishinaabe Gichigami, the Great Water, ran an entire economy on and around this water for centuries before a single European sail appeared on it. Fishing camps, trade routes, seasonal movement between the interior and the shore, birch bark canoes carrying loads that would surprise anyone who has only seen a modern recreational canoe. They were not timid about the lake. They used it constantly. What they did not do was treat it as a road that stays open. Their practice contained 3 rules that every disaster that follows violates, and it is worth naming them plainly, because they are not folklore. They are an observation system built out of several hundred generations of paying attention. The first rule was coastal routing. You travel with the land within reach, not within sight within reach, which is a much stricter standard. If the wind turns, you want to be able to get the hull onto a beach before the sea builds. And on this lake, a sea can build from nothing to dangerous inside 2 hours. Going out into the middle to save distance means accepting that when conditions change, you will have no options for a very long time. The mid-lake shortcut is faster. It is faster in exchange for surrendering every exit. The second rule was seasonal withdrawal. Late in the year, when the storms deepen and the water is cold enough to kill in minutes, the open water stops being a route at all. Travel shifts to the shoreline, to the interior, to the ice roads once the bays freeze hard. The lake does not close because someone declares it closed. It closes because the cost of a mistake becomes total. Withdrawal is not fear, it is accounting. And it has not expired with time. The standard advice given to anyone paddling that coast today is to plan on being windbound one day in every 3 or 4. The third rule was reading the wind before it arrives, particularly an offshore wind. An offshore breeze feels harmless when you are standing on the beach, because the water in front of you is flat, sheltered by the very land you are standing on. Paddle out a mile, and the same wind has had a mile of fetch to work with. Paddle out 5, and it has 5. The calm you launched into was a local artifact of the shore, and the further you go from safety, the stronger and steeper the water gets, which means the trip back is always harder than the trip out. and it gets harder the longer you delay. Anyone who has ever been on any large body of water in a small boat knows this in their body. It is also, in structure, exactly the trap the freighters kept walking into on a scale 500 feet long. Put those three together, and you get a working relationship with a lake that kills people. Use it hard, stay near the edge, quit early, and treat the decision not to travel as a legitimate outcome of the day. Then engines arrived, and the third of those became optional. The hinge is right there, and it is not a story about foolishness. Sail could not fight this lake either, and the schooner era on Superior has its own long list of losses, but a sailing vessel was still bound to the wind. She still had to wait for a slant, still had to accept that some days simply did not permit departure. Steam ended that. A steam engine turns weather from a permission system into a cost. The ship can now leave into a headwind. The ship can now hold a course across the middle. And the moment departure became physically possible in almost any conditions, the decision moved off the water and into an office, where it belonged to people who were not going to be standing on that deck at 3 in the morning. The cargo that drove all of this was iron ore, and the economics of it are worth 2 minutes because they explain nearly every fatal decision that follows. Iron from the ranges of Minnesota and Michigan built the American steel industry. The ore came out of open pits and shafts, went into rail cars, and rolled out onto enormous wooden and later concrete loading docks at Duluth, Two Harbors, Marquette, Ashland, Superior. Those docks are built high, with pockets underneath, so the ore drops by gravity through chutes straight into the ship's holds. Loading a freighter took hours, not days. The mills at the lower end of the system in Cleveland, in Detroit, in Gary, ran on a continuous appetite, and every ton that arrived late was a ton of production somebody had to explain. Then comes the part that turns a business into a hazard. The season has an end. Ice closes the locks at Sault Ste. Marie, historically in mid-January, and reopens them in late March. Nothing sails out of Lake Superior for roughly 10 weeks. Everything that has to move that year has to move before the door shuts, so the pressure does not build gradually across the shipping season. It concentrates violently at the end of it, in the exact weeks when the storms are worst. November is where those two curves cross. The lake is still relatively warm from summer, holding heat that will feed any storm that crosses it. The continental air behind the cold fronts is now genuinely cold. That temperature contrast is fuel. Low-pressure systems tracking up from the southern plains or across the northern prairies deepen as they cross the Great Lakes, and the ones that deepen fastest generate a long, hard fetch down the axis of Superior. Sailors named that weather long before meteorologists explained it. The Witch of November is not a poetic invention. It is a recurring synoptic pattern with a body count. And every November, the fleet is running its heaviest, latest, most valuable trips into it. Add one more layer because it is the one people forget. Sailing these boats was seasonal employment. When the lake closed, the work stopped, and the pay stopped, and it did not start again until spring, which means the incentive to squeeze in one more trip did not belong to the owner alone. It ran the length of the crew list. Nobody in this system had to be reckless for the system to produce recklessness. The calendar did the work. So by the opening years of the 20th century, you have a lake with 300 miles of fetch aligned to the autumn storm track, filled with steel ships that can leave port in any weather, carrying cargo that must move before the ice, crewed by men whose pay depends on completing the run, insured under terms that punish delay, and served by a rescue system that we have not talked about yet, because that is the part everyone assumes will work. It is time to see what happens when all of that arrives on the same weekend. On the morning of November 27, 1905, the steamer Matafa lay at Duluth taking on iron ore. She was a steel bulk carrier of about 430 feet, only 6 years old. Part of the modern fleet rather than the old wooden one. Her master was Captain Richard F. Humble. She was to tow the barge James Nasmyth, which is ordinary practice for the era. The powered steamer pulls a loaded consort on a long steel cable, and the pair moves twice the cargo on one crew of engineers. The Weather Bureau had a storm warning up. This is the first thing that has to be said clearly, because the comfortable version of these stories is that nobody knew. They knew. Warnings were displayed at the harbor. Other masters at Duluth that day looked at the sky and the barometer and stayed tied up. Humble sailed anyway in the afternoon into a northeast wind. Understand what that decision looked like from inside it, because if it looks stupid, you have not understood it. Storm warnings on the Great Lakes were frequent and often overcautious by the standards of a working master. The Mataafa was a modern steel ship, not a tired old wooden hull. She was leaving Duluth, which meant her first hours would be along the North Shore in relatively protected water. Late November meant every day at the dock was a day closer to the end of the season, and a trip that might not happen at all. And Humble had a barge behind him, and a company expecting the ore in the lower lakes. Sailing was the normal answer. It had been the normal answer 100 times. The wind went to the northeast and kept building. By evening, it was a gale, and it was blowing straight down the throat of the western arm of the lake at a loaded ship trying to make easting along the Minnesota shore. Northeast is the wrong direction for the North Shore. It gives the sea a clear run at that coast and turns the whole shoreline into a lee shore, meaning the wind is pushing you onto the rocks rather than off them. There is no shelter for hours in that direction. The coast between Duluth and the Canadian border is basalt cliff and cobble beach, beautiful and completely useless to a ship in trouble. Humble made a decision that any honest sailor will recognize as correct. He turned around. He cast off the Nasmyth, leaving the barge to anchor and ride it out on her own, and he brought the Mataafa back toward Duluth to run for the ship canal. Hold that image, because it matters later. The unpowered barge, cut loose in a gale with no engine and no way to steer herself out of trouble, is going to survive this night intact. The modern powered steamer with a captain who did everything by the book from that point onward is not. The Duluth Ship Canal is a cut straight through the sand spit that shelters the harbor, walled on both sides by long stone and timber piers, with the entrance facing out toward the northeast. In calm weather, it is a gate. In a northeast gale, it becomes one of the most dangerous few hundred yards on the lake, and the reason is pure geometry. The seas run directly at the opening. The piers reflect part of that energy straight back out again, so the incoming waves meet their own reflections, and the water in the entrance stops behaving like a wave train and starts behaving like an explosion. A ship approaching has to make her turn into the gap at exactly the moment the water is doing something unpredictable, with almost no room on either side, and she has to carry enough speed to steer and not so much that she cannot stop. Humble came in on the evening of November 28th with the sea behind him. He nearly made it. The Mataafa struck near the North Pier, and the impact took her steering. Accounts from the day describe a backwater surging out of the canal, heavy water driving her bow down onto the bottom and slamming her stern into the North Pier, and the Mataafa grounding about 100 feet off the end of that pier and roughly 700 feet from the beach, in shallow water, with her stern to the waves. That distance is the entire point of this story, 700 feet from the sand. 100 feet from the end of a pier a man could have walked out onto. Close enough that the crew could see individual people standing on the shore. Close enough to hear them. The waves that had been steep in deep water became something worse in shallow. When a wave moves into water shallower than roughly half its wavelength, the bottom starts to drag on the orbit of the water particles inside it. The wave slows down, the crests bunch closer together, and the energy that was spread through the depth has nowhere to go but up. The wave grows taller and shorter and finally trips over itself and breaks. That is why the surf at a beach is violent, while the same swell offshore is smooth. It is also, and this will matter enormously later, why the shallow approaches to shelter can be the most punishing water a ship crosses. The Mataafa was now aground in breaking surf, being struck repeatedly at the stern by waves that were tripping on the bottom and unloading on her. She broke in two aft of the boiler room within hours. 15 men were in the forward section, in and around the pilot house and the forward crew quarters. 9 men were aft, in the after cabins that housed the engineering department and the galley. And those two groups were now separated by a gap of broken hull with white water running through it. Nobody could cross. Not with a line, not by swimming, not in the dark, not at that water temperature. Here is where the rescue system was supposed to work, and here is what actually happened. The United States Life-Saving Service maintained a station at Duluth under Captain Murdoch McLennan. These were not bystanders. Lifesavers drilled constantly, pulled heavy surf boats through weather that would frighten most modern boaters, and had an institutional culture that treated launching as an obligation. Their equipment was the best available in 1905, a self-righting surf boat, a beach cart, and a Lyle gun, which is a small cannon that fires a projectile trailing a light line out to a wreck. If the line can be caught and secured aboard, heavier ropes follow, and then a breeches buoy, essentially a life ring with canvas legs, can carry men one at a time to the beach. The Duluth crew were not at the canal when the Mataafa struck. They had already been called out to another vessel in trouble, the R.W. England, thrown onto the sand off Park Point about 2 miles away, and their boat and gear were committed there. By the time they got back and got to the canal, they were dealing with the same water that had just wrecked a 430-foot steel steamer. Their attempts to reach the wreck failed. A pulling surf boat cannot be rowed out through breaking surf on top of an offshore wind by men who have already spent the day fighting a different wreck. And the Lyle gun's line, fired across a gale in the dark, will not do the job either if it cannot be caught and made fast by hands that can still work. So the crowd came instead. Estimates from the Duluth papers put as many as 10,000 people on the shore that night. They built bonfires on the beach, not as a spectacle. Fires were the only thing they could offer, because a fire is visible from a wreck, and it tells the men out there that they have not been abandoned. And because if anyone did wash in alive, a fire on the sand was the difference between surviving the beach and dying on it. Think about what that night actually was. 10,000 people close enough to a shipwreck to hear it, unable to do anything except stand in the wind and keep the flames going. Air temperatures below freezing. Spray from the breakers coming over the wreck continuously, freezing on everything it touched, so that the ship was slowly turning white and gaining weight while the men on her tried to stay out of it. The 15 men forward survived because they had a fire and shelter. They broke up the wooden fittings inside the forward cabins and burned them in the ship's own stoves, and they stayed in that section until morning. They were burning the ship to stay on the ship. The 9 men aft did not survive the night. When the lifesavers finally got out to the wreck the next morning, in a sea that had gone down just enough to allow it, they found the after section swept and iced. Several of the bodies were encased in ice on the deck. Accounts differ on exactly how many were found frozen in place, and the exact number is one of those details where contemporary newspapers, official reports, and later retellings do not agree. The consequence is not in dispute. 9 men died within sight of a city, within earshot of a crowd, a few hundred feet from a pier. One of them, a fireman named Thomas Woodgate, is recorded as having tried 4 separate times to work his way forward and having been driven back each time. That is the first thing this lake proves, and most people watching a shoreline never quite believe it until they see the numbers. Proximity is not rescue. Distance to safety and access to safety are different quantities. A man 700 feet from 10,000 people can be as unreachable as a man in the middle of the ocean if the water between them is breaking, if the temperature is low enough to disable him in minutes, and if the only equipment capable of crossing that gap is already committed somewhere else. And that same storm was doing the same thing along 100 miles of coast at the same time, because a single ship in trouble is never the whole picture on this lake. Up the north shore, near a headland called Gold Rock Point, the schooner barge Madeira had been cast off by the steamer towing her, the William Edenborn, when the master decided he could no longer manage both vessels. A barge without power in a northeast gale on a lee shore has one future. She was driven against the rock face, which rises out of deep water with no beach to strand on, and began to break up against it. There is one moment in this entire century of wrecks where a rescue works cleanly, and this is it. And it worked, because one person did something extraordinarily dangerous with no equipment at all. A seaman named Fred Benson climbed to the rigging and jumped from the wreck onto the rock face itself, carrying a line, and climbed the cliff. From above he lowered that line, brought 4 men up off the disintegrating hull one at a time, then hauled up a heavier rope for the rest. Most of the crew got off. 1 man was lost. Note what the successful rescue required. It did not require a lighthouse, a forecast, a telegraph, or an institution. It required a man to gamble his life on a jump onto wet rock in a gale, and it required the wreck to be close enough to a climbable surface that the gamble was even possible. That is not a system. That is luck plus courage, and neither one scales. The storm of November 27 to 29, 1905, is remembered as the Mataafa blow, because the wreck at Duluth happened in front of an audience, but the tally across Lake Superior was much larger. Something close to 30 vessels were wrecked, stranded, or badly damaged, and roughly 35 people died. The steel steamer Lafayette was driven onto the rocks at Encampment Island and broken in two, and most of her crew got off by climbing the cliff she had been thrown against, though one of her firemen was killed trying to slide down a rope strung between the wreck and the rock. And the steamer Ira H. Owen, downbound with grain, simply vanished off Outer Island in the Apostles with everyone aboard. A crew usually counted at 19. She was seen, she was heard from, and then she was gone. Her wreck has never been found. 2 ships from the same storm. One breaks apart 700 feet from a city beach with 15 survivors. One disappears into open water and leaves nothing to investigate at all. That contrast is the shape of every decade that follows. So what did the country do about it? It built a lighthouse. The Lake Carriers Association, the trade body representing the ship owners, pressed Congress hard after 1905. And in early 1907, Congress appropriated $75,000 for a light station and fog signal on the Minnesota North Shore. There was a real navigational argument behind it. The rock along that coast contains iron formations strong enough to pull a magnetic compass off true, so a master running the shore at night in poor visibility could be steering an accurate course by an instrument that was quietly lying to him. Building the station was genuinely difficult. There is no natural landing at the site, and there was no road until 1924, so everything, the steel, the brick, the lens, the fuel, came in on lighthouse tenders and went up a 130-foot cliff face on a steam derrick. The light was first lit in the summer of 1910. Split Rock Lighthouse is now one of the most photographed structures in the American Midwest. It also would not have saved a single one of the 9 men who died on the Mataafa. That is not a cheap shot at the engineers. It is the pattern this entire story is built on, and 1905 is the first clean example of it. A lighthouse solves the problem of not knowing where you are. The Mataafa knew exactly where she was. Her captain had navigated correctly, turned back correctly, and brought his ship to the entrance of his home port. What killed his engine room crew was that a ship could be destroyed at the door of a harbor, and that nobody on shore possessed a means of crossing a few hundred feet of breaking, near-freezing water to take men off a deck, Every era answers the previous disaster with the tool it happens to have. Lights, then radio, then radar, then satellite forecasting. Each one is real. Each one improves something. And each one leaves the same hole in the middle, which is the physical act of removing a human being from a failing ship in bad water at distance, in time. To understand why that hole matters so much on this particular lake, you have to understand what the water does to a body, because it is not what most people assume, and because it is the second machine driving everything that follows. Below its surface layer, Lake Superior sits at roughly 4 degrees Celsius, and in the storm season, the surface is falling toward the same figure. Anyone entering that water goes through a sequence that has been studied in detail, and the sequence is fast. The first phase is cold shock, and it hits within seconds. Skin receptors fire and trigger an involuntary gasp, followed by uncontrolled hyperventilation. If that gasp happens with a face underwater, or as a breaking crest arrives, water goes into the lungs immediately. This is why people who could swim well drown in the first minute, and why a life jacket alone is not an answer. The jacket keeps a body at the surface. It does not stop the gasp. The second phase is the one that ends most rescues before they start. Within roughly 3 to 10 minutes in water this cold, the muscles of the hands and forearms cool to the point where fine control collapses. Grip goes first. A person in that state cannot climb a ladder, cannot fasten a harness, cannot hold a rope thrown from a boat, cannot open a buckle, cannot pull himself into a raft. He may still be fully conscious. He may still be talking. He simply cannot make his hands do anything. And the machinery of rescue, from a Lyle gun line in 1905 to a helicopter basket in 1975, assumes hands that work. Only after that does hypothermia in the ordinary sense take over, and unconsciousness follows well before an hour in most cases. So the practical rescue window on Lake Superior in November is not measured in hours. For a person in the water, it is measured in minutes, and for a person clinging to a hull, it is measured by how long they can stay out of the spray. That single fact is the reason 9 men died on the Matafa within sight of a bonfire, and the reason a lighthouse was never going to be the answer. There is a second, colder consequence of the same temperature, and it explains something that has generated a century of half-mythical talk about this lake. A body in water is slightly denser than fresh water and sinks. It returns to the surface later only because bacteria in the digestive tract produce gas as decomposition proceeds, and that gas provides buoyancy. The rate of that process depends almost entirely on temperature. In warm water, it can take a day or two. Near 4 degrees, bacterial activity is suppressed so heavily that the gas may never form in sufficient quantity at all. The bodies stay down. Sailors on these lakes have said for generations that Superior does not give up her dead. That is not a legend. It is a description of bacterial metabolism at 4 degrees Celsius, and it will come back in this story twice in a way that changes what the word rescue even means, which brings up the institution that was supposed to close the gap, the men who launched the boats. By the early 20th century, the United States Life-Saving Service, later absorbed into the Coast Guard, kept stations around the American shore of Superior, Duluth, the Portage Ship Canal, Eagle Harbor on the Keweenaw, Marquette, and a string of them along the stretch of Michigan coast between Munising and Whitefish Point that the crews themselves called the Shipwreck Coast, Grand Marais, Deer Park, Crisp Point, Vermilion Point. These stations were genuinely well run. The crews drilled weekly, they knew their beaches, and the service's unofficial standard was that you had to go out. But look at the arithmetic instead of the reputation. A station on these lakes was a keeper and 6 to 8 surfmen. The shoreline of Lake Superior, counting islands, is over 2,700 miles. The equipment at each station was a boat pulled by oars, later fitted with early motors, whose realistic operating radius in survivable conditions was a few miles from its own beach. Between stations there were gaps of 20, 30, 50 miles of cliff and sand where a wreck could occur, and no organized help could arrive for many hours, by which time the water temperature had already decided the outcome. And there was one more limitation that nobody talks about, and which turns out to be decisive. The stations were seasonal. On the Great Lakes, the service's active season ran roughly from April to December, and the crews were hired for exactly that window. When the season ended, the stations emptied. That made budgetary sense because when there is no shipping, there is nothing to rescue. But the loss curve does not flatten at the end of November, it spikes, which means the period of maximum danger on this lake overlaps with the period when the rescue system is winding down, thinning out, and in some places already shut for the winter. Hold that. It is going to matter more than anything else in the winter of 1927. 8 years after the Mataafa, in November 1913, the entire Great Lakes system was hit by the worst storm in its recorded history. Two separate low-pressure systems came together over the lakes and produced sustained winds in the range of 60 miles an hour with far higher gusts, snow so thick it blinded navigation for days, and, on Lake Huron, a wind that shifted violently and caught ships that had already survived the first half of the storm from the opposite direction. More than 250 people died. Around a dozen large vessels were destroyed outright. On Huron, several capsized freighters were found floating upside down, which is why the storm's other name in the trade is the Big Blow, and why some crews called it a white hurricane. Lake Superior's share of that storm produced one wreck that took 100 years to explain, and one rescue that shows exactly how far the system could stretch when everything went right. Start with the rescue, because it establishes the geography that the loss depends on. The steamer L.C. Waldo was running the length of Superior in that storm when a sea took her pilot house off. That is not damage in the ordinary sense. Losing the pilot house means losing the wheel, the compass, the chart, and the shelter all at once in a snowstorm at night. Her master, Captain John Duddleson, worked her downwind toward the only lee available in the middle of the lake, the Keweenaw Peninsula, steering with an emergency arrangement below decks and a hand compass. She did not make the shelter. At 8 in the morning, she struck Gull Rock, near Manitou Island off the tip of the Keweenaw, and broke in two. Her crew, 26 men and 2 women, got forward into the bow section, which stayed above water. They had no heat and no food. They built a fire from wooden fittings torn out of the ship, in a bathtub by most accounts, exactly as the men on the Mataafa had done 8 years earlier. Spray froze around them as they sat there, until the ice had effectively sealed them into the bow. They stayed like that for about 90 hours. 90 hours. 4 days. The life-saving station at Eagle Harbor, 30 miles away, did not even learn there was a wreck until the following day, and when the crews did know, they could not reach it, because the same sea that wrecked the Waldo would have destroyed a surf boat. They waited for a workable gap in the weather. When it came, the portage crew went out with the tug Hebbard, and a lifesaver named John Beck jumped from the boat onto the ice-covered wreck to get a line secured. Everybody aboard came off alive, a genuine success, and worth being precise about why it worked. The Waldo did not sink. She grounded on rock and stayed put with part of her hull above the water. Her crew could get to an enclosed space and make a fire. And there were 2 stations within reach of the Keweenaw tip. Change any one of those 3, and the outcome flips. Now change all 3 at once, and you get the Henry B. Smith. She was a 545-foot steel bulk carrier built in 1906, 7 years old in 1913, which in that fleet made her nearly new and among the largest hulls on Freshwater. Her master was Captain James Owen, an experienced man with a long record. In November 1913, she was at Marquette, on the south shore of Superior, taking on iron ore, and the loading was going badly. The ore was frozen in the dock pockets. That detail sounds like housekeeping. It is actually the whole situation in one sentence. Ore loaded into the chutes and pockets of a dock in freezing weather turns into a solid mass that will not flow. Men had to work it loose. It had already been a delayed season, and the smith was behind, and every hour spent hammering frozen ore out of a chute was an hour closer to the ice date that shuts the entire lake. The storm was already known. Ships all over the lakes had taken shelter. The first phase of the system had already come through, and on November 9th there was a lull at Marquette. A lull in a Great Lakes storm is one of the most expensive things on this lake, and it is worth saying exactly why. When a deep low crosses the region, the wind does not simply blow hard and then stop. It swings around the circulation of the system, and the passage of a front or the eye of the low can produce a period of an hour or several hours where the wind drops and the sky lifts, and the harbor looks manageable. Then the wind returns from a completely different quarter, often stronger, into a sea that is still running from the old direction. Two wave trains from different directions crossing each other produce the steepest, most chaotic water a ship will ever meet, because when two crests coincide, their heights add. Owen sailed into the lull late in the day on November 9th. He sailed with hatches still being worked. The Smith had 32 cargo hatches along her spar deck. Securing them in 1913 was not a matter of pushing a lever. Each hatch had heavy covers, and over them a tarpaulin, and over the tarpaulin wooden battens driven tight with steel wedges by hand, one at a time, all the way around the coaming. Doing that properly across 32 hatches is hours of physical labor in the cold, and witnesses on shore described her leaving with crew still working on deck. Understand what an unsecured hatch means on a loaded ore boat, because it is not a small oversight, and it is not a detail that only matters in an academic sense. These ships are designed to run with very little freeboard. Loaded, the spar deck is only a few feet above the waterline, and green water crossing the deck is a normal, expected, everyday event. The entire survival case for the design rests on one assumption: the hatches keep that water out of the cargo hold. A properly battened hatch turns a boarding sea into a nuisance. An unbattened hatch turns the same sea into flooding directly on top of the cargo. So Owen left port with the ship's primary defense not yet in place, in a known storm in November, on a lake with 300 miles of fetch. Why would a competent master do that? The uncomfortable answer is that the two versions of this story have been fighting for 100 years, and the evidence does not close it. One version, repeated in the trade for decades, is that Owen was under direct pressure from the vessel's owners to move that cargo or lose his command, and that a threatening message reached him at Marquette. The Hawgood interests, who controlled the vessel, denied any such pressure. No document has ever settled it. What can be said without dispute is that the structural pressure existed regardless of whether anyone put it into words. The season was closing, the ship was late, the cargo was loaded, and the crew's pay and the owner's revenue both depended on completing runs before the ice. That kind of pressure does not need a threat to work. It only needs a calendar. The plan, as far as anyone can reconstruct it, was ordinary. Run east along the south shore toward the Sioux. Secure hatches underway in the lee of the land, deliver the ore down at Cleveland. The wind came back that evening from the north and northwest, hard with heavy snow. Witnesses on shore, the last people to see her, described the Smith turning to port, not continuing east, turning north up the lake, which puts her heading for the Keweenaw Shadow, the same lee that the crew of the L.C. Waldo were trying to reach in the same storm. That is a rational, defensible decision by a man who has just realized that his ship cannot take a following northerly sea across an open deck with hatches not yet secure. Running for the lee gives him flat water, time, and the ability to finish the job. It also required something he could not have: a turn. To go from east to north across a building northerly sea, A 545-foot ship has to swing broadside to the waves and stay there while she comes around. That is the most dangerous 90 seconds in any storm maneuver. Broadside. A hull rolls into the troughs, the deck tilts. Water comes aboard along the entire length rather than over the bow, and anything unsecured on that deck is now taking the full weight of a breaking crest from the side. The snow closed in behind her. Nobody on shore saw anything after that. All hands were lost, a crew of 25. Exactly 2 bodies were ever recovered, and where they turned up says more about this lake than any inquiry could. Second cook H.R. Haskin was found floating near Whitefish Point, at the far eastern end of Superior. Third engineer John Gallagher came ashore on Ile Parisienne in Canadian water near the outlet, and he was not found until the spring of 1914. Both of them had traveled the length of the lake. The other 23 were never found at all, which by now you can explain yourself. 4 degrees Celsius, suppressed decomposition, no buoyancy, no return to the surface. And then the strangest part of the Henry B. Smith, which is not what happened to her, but what did not happen afterward. She stayed lost for 99 years. A 545-foot steel ship, in a lake with land on both sides, less than 100 miles from a major harbor, sitting on the bottom of a body of water that was crossed daily by hundreds of vessels for the next century, and nobody could find her. Not the searches in 1913, not the sonar surveys of the following decades. In May 2013, 3 Great Lakes shipwreck researchers working with side-scan sonar, Jerry Eliason, Craig Smith, and Ken Merriman, located a large steel wreck about 30 miles north of Marquette. They came back the following month with a camera and read the name off her hull, the Henry B. Smith, sitting upright in roughly 535 feet of water, broken in 2 near the middle, her cargo scattered across the bottom around her. Think about what that 99 years actually means, because it reframes everything you assume about a lake versus an ocean. On a map, Superior looks searchable. You could stand at Marquette and watch a storm come across it, but the numbers do not care about the map. 31,000 square miles of surface. Depths that make diving impossible over most of the wreck-producing water. A bottom that is not flat, with ridges and boulder fields that look like broken hulls on sonar. Search that with the technology of 1913 or 1950 or 1980, and a 545-foot ship is a needle. She is a large object in an enormous, dark, cold room. That gap between how a place looks and how it behaves is the thing this lake does to people over and over. It looks bounded. It is not bounded in any way that helps you. The wreck itself came with a final complication, and it is a warning about every conclusion that follows. The Smith lies broken. Her hull is in more than one piece, and a broken hull on the bottom does not tell you when it broke. A ship can split on the surface under hogging and sagging loads, and then sink in 2 pieces. Or she can go down intact, flooded and heavy, and break on impact when the bow strikes bottom 5 feet below, while the stern is still coming down behind it. The steel looks similar afterward. 62 years later, that ambiguity will sit at the center of the most argued shipwreck investigation in American inland history, and no amount of underwater video will resolve it. The Mataafa proved that proximity is not rescue. The Smith proved the second rule of this lake, and it is a harder one. The trap is the schedule, and the trap does not need anyone to behave badly. It only needs a season with an end date, a cargo with a destination, and a lull. There is a third rule, and to find it, you have to go to the wrong end of the year entirely, to a lake already turning to ice, and to an island in the middle of it that is one of the loneliest pieces of ground in North America. Isle Royale lies in the northwestern quarter of the lake, a long ridge of rock about 45 miles from end to end, closer to the Minnesota and Ontario shore than to the Michigan mainland that governs it. The geology that built it is the reason it wrecks ships. The island is the exposed edge of a series of ancient tilted lava flows, and those flows do not stop at the waterline. They continue out under the lake as parallel reefs and ridges, some of which rise to within a few feet of the surface miles from any visible land. A vessel approaching Isle Royale in clear weather sees a wooded island. A vessel approaching it in snow at night is running toward a rock field whose outer edge is nowhere near where the island appears to be. In summer, it was a place of small fishing settlements and lodges. In December, it was empty. No permanent winter population to speak of, no telegraph, no supply, nothing but forest, snow, and rock, sitting in the middle of a lake that was starting to close. The Kamloops was a Canadian package freighter, 250 feet, built in England in 1924 and only 3 years old. She was not an ore boat. She carried general merchandise, machinery, coiled wire, paper mill equipment, shoes, tinned goods, the kind of mixed freight that supplies a city. She was working the last run of the 1927 season, up from the lower lakes to the head of Lake Superior at what is now Thunder Bay. Last run of the season. You already know what that phrase costs on this lake. By early December, she was in Superior in company with another vessel, the Quedoc, and both ships were icing. Icing is the mechanism that makes December different from November, and it is worth understanding physically because it kills in a way that has nothing to do with waves breaking the ship. When air temperatures drop well below freezing and a ship drives into a sea, spray comes over the bow continuously and freezes on contact with every surface it lands on. Rigging, masts, railings, ventilators, the tops of deckhouses, the anchor gear. The accumulation is not decorative. In serious conditions, a vessel can take on tons of ice per hour. Here is why that specific weight is lethal. A ship stays upright because her center of gravity is low relative to her center of buoyancy. So when she rolls, the geometry generates a force that pushes her back upright. Ice does not accumulate low. It accumulates high on everything above the deck, which is exactly the worst place to add mass. As the ice builds, the center of gravity climbs, the restoring force weakens, and the roll changes character. She goes over further, and she comes back slower, and she hangs at the end of each roll a little longer. Every sailor who has been in it describes the same sensation, that pause at the end of the roll, where the ship seems to think about whether she is coming back. Ice does a second thing. It plugs the freeing ports, the openings in the bulwarks, that let boarded water drain off the deck. Blocked ports mean the water stays aboard, and water on deck slides to the low side as the ship rolls, adding its weight to the roll instead of resisting it. The countermeasure is men with axes and wooden mallets, on an open deck, in the dark, in spray that is freezing on their clothing while they work, chopping ice off structures they have to climb to reach, in a seaway that is trying to throw them into the lake. That is the actual job. It is not heroic in the way a film would show it. It is exhausting, freezing, poorly lit, and often ineffective, because the ice comes back faster than the crew can remove it. The Quedoc, running ahead of her in heavy snow, came up on the rocks of Isle Royale far too close, turned hard away, and blew the danger signal astern to warn the ship behind. Nobody knows whether the Kamloops heard it. When the Quedoc's people looked back, she was no longer with them. The last sighting is generally placed late on the night of December 6th. She was never seen again by anyone who lived to say so. Follow the rescue effort from here, and pay attention to the calendar rather than the courage, because the courage was never in question. The Kamloops was not immediately reported as lost, because a ship that has fallen out of company in a snowstorm is not yet a ship in distress. She was overdue at the head of the lake, then more overdue, and only then did the owners begin organizing a search. The official search started on December 12th, with vessels working the North Shore and the bays around Isle Royale. They were searching a wilderness coastline in a lake that was starting to freeze, in the shortest days of the year. with a few hours of usable light and no way to see into the bays that were already skimming over. And the search itself was now a hazard to the searchers. A steel ship poking into shallow, reef-strewn, half-frozen bays in December to look for wreckage is a ship that can become the next casualty. Before the end of December, the search was given up, not because anyone concluded the crew was dead. Tug captains reportedly wanted to keep working the bays of Isle Royale on the chance that somebody was alive in one of them. It ended because the lake was closing, and staying out there was no longer survivable for the people doing the looking. This is where the story stops being about a shipwreck and becomes something worse. In the spring of 1928, when the ice went out and fishermen returned to Isle Royale for the season, they began finding bodies on the island. 2 were found on May 26 near 12 o'clock point. 6 more turned up on June 4th, and a 9th was found inland, away from the water, believed to be the ship's first mate. 9 bodies out of 22. Only 5 of the 9 could be identified well enough to be sent home to a family. Read that again, slowly. A body inland is not a body that washed up. At least 1 person off that ship reached Isle Royale alive in early December, on an uninhabited island in the middle of Lake Superior, and walked far enough from the water to die away from it. There was no one left on that island to find them, no vessel that could safely come for them, no radio to call with, and no way to walk off across a lake that was neither open water nor solid ice. Among the dead was Alice Bettridge, the ship's assistant stewardess, one of the youngest people aboard. A year later, in December 1928, a trapper is said to have found a bottle in the Agawa River containing a note in her hand that she was the last one left alive, freezing and starving on Isle Royale, and that she wanted her mother and father to know what had happened to her. Her parents reportedly identified the handwriting. It is not the kind of document anyone can independently verify, and it has been doubted, and it changes nothing about the part that is documented, which is already harder to sit with. People came off that wreck onto land and were not rescued because the season had ended and the machinery of rescue had gone home. All 22 aboard died. The wreck stayed missing for 50 years. On August 21st, 1977, a group of sport divers running a systematic search located her off the northwest end of Isle Royale, lying over on her starboard side at the base of an underwater cliff in more than 260 feet of water. That is past the limit of safe recreational diving, and people have died on that wreck since, which tells you something about the pull these hulls have on the living. What the cold preserved down there is the part that stays with divers. The cargo is still identifiable after decades: crates of shoes, tar paper, paper-making machinery, coils of farm fencing wire, tubes of toothpaste, and wooden boxes of Lifesavers candy, still sitting where they were stowed. The wheel, the engine room. And in that engine room, wedged under a stairway, the remains of one of the crew, preserved by 4-degree water in a state that divers who have seen it describe with obvious discomfort. They gave him a nickname, which is what people do when they need distance from something. That preservation is not a curiosity. It is the same mechanism that kept the bodies of the Matafa's engine room crew locked in ice on a deck in 1905, and the same mechanism that has kept 29 men on the bottom since 1975. The cold does not care about the difference between a body it keeps at the surface and a body it keeps at the bottom. It simply stops the processes that would otherwise return them. So the Kamloops closes a question this story has been carrying since Duluth, and it closes it in the worst available way. The question was why bodies from this lake so rarely come back. The answer is temperature. And the answer has a second half. Even the people who beat the water can lose. Because on Lake Superior in December, surviving the sinking is not survival. Reaching land is not reaching help. The rescue window on this lake does not close for hours. It closes for months. Which leads directly into the next question, the one that runs through the rest of this story. If the problem was that nobody could find you, nobody could reach you, and nobody could talk to you, then surely the answer was communication, detection, and speed. The industry got all three. It got them in a hurry. Radio came first, and its effect on this lake was genuinely transformative. A vessel with a radio telephone is no longer alone in the way the Kamloops was alone. She can hear a forecast that was issued after she sailed. She can report her position so that if she stops reporting, somebody knows roughly where to look and roughly when she stopped. She can talk to the ship ahead of her and ask what the water is doing where that ship is now, which is the single most useful piece of weather information in existence and the one no forecast can match. By the middle of the 20th century, ship-to-ship and ship-to-shore radio was ordinary equipment, and the era in which a freighter could simply disappear without anyone learning of it for a week was over. Forecasting improved next, and improved enormously. The Weather Bureau of 1905 was working from surface observations and telegraph reports, issuing warnings that were often right in direction and wrong in intensity. By the 1930s, there were balloon soundings giving a picture of the atmosphere above the ground. By the 1950s, there were computers doing numerical prediction. By the 1960s, there were satellites looking down at the storm systems themselves. The result by the 1970s is that a captain on Lake Superior could know a full day in advance that a significant low was going to cross the lake, and could know within a few hours when the wind would shift and roughly how hard it would blow. Radar arrived out of the war and changed the operating rules more than anything else on this list. Before radar, navigating in snow or fog meant compass, clock, lead line, whistle echoes off cliffs, and a great deal of prayer, so the sensible response to zero visibility was to slow down, anchor, or stay in port. Radar removed that constraint. A master could now see the shoreline he could not see, find the point he was steering for, and track another vessel 8 miles away in a blizzard. It made winter navigation practical. It also, and this is the part that matters, eliminated the last physical reason to wait for weather to clear. The ships got larger and stronger. The freighters of 1905 were 400 to 450 feet. By 1913, 550. By the 1950s, 700 and beyond. In 1958, the Edmund Fitzgerald came off the ways at River Rouge as the largest vessel on the Great Lakes at 729 feet, and by 1972, the first 1,000-foot carrier was in service. Welded steel replaced riveted plate. Engines got more powerful, so a ship could hold a heading against a sea that would have overwhelmed a triple-expansion steamer. The cargo changed too. The rich direct shipping ore of the Mesabi Range was largely worked out by the 1950s, and the industry moved to taconite, a low-grade rock that is crushed, concentrated, and rolled into hard pellets before shipping. Pellets flow cleanly, load fast, and behave predictably in a hold, and they are dense, so a full cargo sits low in the ship. And the season stretched. Through the 1960s and 1970s, there were deliberate programs to extend navigation deeper into winter, with ice-breaking support and air bubbler systems at the locks, because every extra week of shipping was worth a great deal of money to the steel industry. Look at that list honestly. Every item on it is a real improvement, and anyone who tells you these ships were no safer than the wooden schooners is selling something. Losses fell. Crews stopped disappearing routinely. The 1913 storm killed more than 250 people on the lakes in 4 days, and nothing remotely like that has happened since. Now look at what none of it touched. Radio tells people that you are in trouble. It does not put a boat next to you. Radar shows you the shoal you are about to hit. It does not remove ice from your rigging or water from your hold. A forecast tells you a storm is coming. It does not create a harbor where there is no harbor, and on the eastern half of Lake Superior, between the Keweenaw and Whitefish Point, there is no harbor a loaded 700-foot freighter can duck into. The forecast may simply inform a crew, accurately and in good time, that they are going to spend the next 14 hours in survival conditions with nowhere to go. And here is the trade that nobody signed for explicitly. Every one of those improvements expanded the boundary of what counted as an acceptable risk. Bigger ships meant more value in one hull and more hull spanning more waves. Radar meant sailing in weather that used to mean staying at the dock. Season extension meant more traffic in December and January, when the water is coldest and the rescue infrastructure thinnest. Reliable forecasts meant that a storm which would once have kept the whole fleet in port now became a scheduling problem, something to be timed rather than avoided. And there is a very large difference between a master who cannot sail and a master who has been given enough information to convince himself he can. There is one more change. It is the least known and possibly the most consequential. Freeboard is the distance from the waterline to the deck, and it is the ship's reserve of buoyancy and her margin against boarding seas. Load line rules set the legal minimum. In 1969, again in 1971, and again in 1973, the Coast Guard raised the load line on Great Lakes vessels, which allowed the same hulls to be loaded meaningfully deeper than when they were built. For the Edmund Fitzgerald, the 3 changes added up to 3 feet and 3 inches less minimum freeboard than she had been designed to keep. 3 feet 3 inches does not sound like much. On a ship whose loaded deck already runs only a handful of feet above the surface, 3 feet is a large fraction of the entire margin. It means more tons of cargo per trip, which is exactly why it was done. It also means the deck is lower, boarding seas are heavier and more frequent, and the hull is carrying more weight through the same hogging and sagging cycle in the same short, steep, superior waves. That decision was legal, deliberate, and made by the regulator. It is the clearest example in this entire history of capability being converted directly into exposure rather than into margin. And it was in force on the afternoon of November 9, 1975, when a 729-foot freighter left Superior, Wisconsin, with 26,116 long tons of taconite pellets, bound for the steel mills at Zug Island near Detroit. Her master was Captain Ernest McSorley, 63 years old, more than 40 years on the lakes, master since he was in his 30s, which made him one of the most experienced men in the fleet. Nothing in what follows is the story of an inexperienced crew. The forecast was known before departure. Gale warnings were up for Lake Superior. During the night, they were upgraded to storm warnings. McSorley sailed anyway, and so did Captain Jesse Cooper of the Arthur M. Anderson, a 716-foot freighter that left the same area a short time earlier. The two masters talked by radio and agreed on a plan, and the plan was not reckless. It was the standard, sensible response of that fleet to a November low. Instead of running the direct route down the middle of the lake, go north. Cross toward the Canadian shore and run east along it, using the land to the north as a windbreak while the storm came up from the southwest. Then turn down and across toward Whitefish Point at the far end, once the worst of it had passed north. That is the entire toolkit of Great Lakes storm seamanship in one decision. The same instinct the Anishinaabe used in canoes, and the same one the Henry B. Smith's captain reached for when he turned toward the Keweenaw. Put land between yourself and the wind. Keep the fetch short. It worked for a while. Through the night of November 9th, the two ships ran northeast toward the Canadian shore. With the wind behind them, and the Fitzgerald, which was slightly faster, drew ahead. By early morning, they were up near the top of the lake. The storm center crossed, and the wind did what a deep low always does. It swung around. It had been from the northeast, then it went south and southeast, and by the middle of the day on November 10th, it came in hard from the northwest. That shift is the moment the plan stopped working. And it is worth being precise about why, because it is the same geometry that has been running through this story since the first page. The northern route protects you from a wind coming from the south and west. Because the Canadian Highlands are between you and the weather. It gives you nothing at all against a wind from the northwest, and worse, once you turn southeast and run down toward Whitefish Point, you are heading down the long axis of the lake with a northwest gale coming over your stern quarter. That is now the maximum fetch condition. The wind has the whole width and much of the length of Superior to work with, aimed at the same corner both ships are trying to reach. They were, in other words, committed. 2 loaded freighters, deep in the water, running for the only shelter within 100 miles, with the storm now behind them, pushing them toward it. Turning around was not an option worth considering. Turning around means putting the ship beam on to the sea during the turn, and then steaming into 70-knot winds for hours toward a shore with no harbor. Anchoring in that depth of water in that sea is not possible. Heaving to and riding it out means many more hours of exposure. Whitefish Bay was the answer. It had always been the answer. That is the whole reason ships aim for that corner. By early afternoon on November 10th, the 2 ships were passing to the north of Caribou Island, roughly midway down the eastern end of the lake, with the Fitzgerald ahead, and the Anderson perhaps 10 to 17 miles behind, depending on the point in the afternoon. Caribou Island matters, and it matters because of a shoal. North of the island, there is a shallow area known in the trade as 6 Fathom Shoal. 6 fathoms is 36 feet. Charts of that period showed the shoal, but later survey work indicated the shallow ground extended further east than the charts of 1975 depicted. Captain Cooper on the Anderson watched the Fitzgerald's track on radar and, in his later testimony, said he believed she passed too close to that shallow ground, closer than he was comfortable with. Close enough that he remarked on it at the time. Nobody on the Fitzgerald ever reported hitting anything. Somewhere around 3:30 in the afternoon, McSorley called the Anderson with the first hard evidence that something was wrong. He reported a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list to starboard. He said he was checking down, meaning slowing, and he asked Cooper to stay by him until he reached Whitefish. Take that transmission apart because everything that follows lives inside it. A fence rail down means part of the deck railing has been torn off. That alone tells you the seas are coming aboard with real force. But the vents are the serious item. The vents in question serve the ballast tanks that run along the sides and bottom of the hull. Those tanks are filled to make the ship sit low when she is empty and pumped out when she loads cargo. They have to breathe, so they have vent pipes that stick up above the deck with covers on them. If a vent is torn off, the tank below it now has an open pipe to the sky on a deck that is repeatedly under solid water. Every sea that crosses that deck pours some of itself down into a tank that is supposed to be under the crew's control. And a list confirms it. A list is asymmetric weight. Water going into tanks on one side and not the other, or cargo hold flooding unevenly, tilts the ship. And a tilted ship puts one side of the deck lower into the water, which lets more water aboard on that side, which increases the list. Once that loop starts, it feeds itself. McSorley had pumps running, and he said so on the radio. The Fitzgerald carried 6 bilge pumps. By the accounts of that afternoon, he had 2 of them working, and he put the big ballast pumps on it as well. The fact that he had them running and still had a list means water was entering at a rate that mattered. Here is a competent master doing everything right and losing an option anyway. He slowed down. Checking down reduces the force of the seas coming aboard and reduces the stress on a hull that may already be damaged. It also means he arrives later, and every extra hour is another hour of flooding. He asked for company. Requesting that the Anderson stay with him is exactly what the situation called for. He had no way to fix a torn vent in that weather. Nobody could work that deck. The correct move was to keep going toward shelter with another vessel in visual and radar contact. Then, at around 4:10, McSorley called again with the transmission that removed his last independent capability. Both of his radars were out. Look at where he is when that happens. It is dark, or nearly. It is snowing. The The ship is listing, damaged, and taking water. He is running in the shallowing eastern end of the lake, toward a corner full of hazards, with land ahead and a point to round, and he has just gone blind. He cannot see the shoreline. He cannot see the shoals. He cannot see the ships around him. He has a compass, a chart, a fathometer of limited use in that sea, and nothing else. He asked the Anderson to provide navigational assistance, and the Anderson did. Cooper's people began plotting the Fitzgerald on their own radar and passing her headings and distances by radio, effectively navigating another ship remotely from 10 miles astern in a full gale. That worked. It is one of the more impressive pieces of practical seamanship in the record, and it kept the Fitzgerald on a workable course for the last 3 hours of her existence. It also created a dependency. The Fitzgerald was now navigating on borrowed eyes. There was supposed to be a backup. Whitefish Point, the corner they were running for, had a lighthouse and a radio direction beacon. And a radio beacon is precisely the tool a blind ship needs. It transmits, the ship's radio direction finder points at it, and you steer down the bearing. It is the one piece of navigation equipment that keeps working when your radar does not. At 20 to 5 in the afternoon, half an hour after losing his radars, McSorley called the Coast Guard at Sault Ste. Marie and asked about it. He was told that the light and the beacon at Whitefish Point were both out. The storm had knocked out power there. He kept asking. He called other vessels to find out whether the light was showing yet, and somewhere between 5 and 5:30 he reached Captain Cedric Woodard, aboard a Swedish saltwater ship called the Avafors. By then, Woodard could see the light again. The radio beacon, the one part of it a blind ship could actually steer by, stayed down. Woodard's later testimony preserved what McSorley told him, that he had a bad list, that he had lost both radars, and that he was taking heavy seas over the deck in one of the worst seas he had ever been in. In the middle of that same exchange, Woodard heard him break off and shout an order at his own crew over the open radio. Nobody was to go out on deck. That order is the human center of this whole night. Do not go out on deck. It is the correct order. On a listing ship in 30-foot seas at night in November, sending a man out to look at a vent is sending him to die. It is also an admission that the damage cannot be assessed and cannot be fixed. From that moment, the ship's condition is a question nobody aboard can answer. They can feel the list. They can hear the pumps. They cannot see the hold. Around 6:30, the Anderson took 2 extraordinarily large seas. Cooper described them afterward. Waves that came over the stern, put water on the boat deck 35 feet above the waterline, drove her down, and then rolled on ahead of her to the southeast in the direction of the Fitzgerald. That is one captain's account, and it cannot be verified independently. It is also entirely consistent with what is now known about how wave energy behaves in a fetch-driven sea, where crests occasionally coincide and produce a group substantially higher than the surrounding water. Whether those particular waves reached the Fitzgerald 10 miles ahead, and what they did if they arrived, is not established and never will be. At around 7:10, the Anderson's first mate, Morgan Clark, called the Fitzgerald to warn her about another vessel showing on radar ahead of her and to ask how she was making out. The reply is the last thing anyone ever heard from the ship. 5 words: "We are holding our own." Minutes after that, the Fitzgerald's target went off the Anderson's radar screen. It did not blink out dramatically. In heavy seas, a radar screen is full of clutter, the return from wave crests, and a target can fade in and out of that mess normally. Clark and Cooper watched for her to come back. They called again. They tried other channels. They called other vessels in the area to ask whether anyone had the Fitzgerald on radar or on the radio. And one after another, nobody did. Snow squalls were passing through. She had been 10 miles ahead. She should have been visible on the screen and audible on the radio. At a certain point, Cooper stopped hoping and started reporting. Now watch the machinery of rescue from the beginning, because this is the part of every maritime disaster that the public imagines as a single event and which is actually a chain of 8 or 9 separate steps, each of which takes time, and any of which can add an hour. Recognition came first, and it came from a merchant captain, not from any monitoring system. There was no automatic alarm. The Fitzgerald had no device that reported her own sinking. She had life rafts that would float free, and emergency beacons in 1975 were nothing like the ones carried now. The only reason anyone on Earth knew she was gone within the hour is that another ship happened to be following her by radar and talking to her by voice. Notification came next, and it went badly at first. Cooper was on to the Coast Guard at Sault Ste. Marie by around 8 o'clock and was initially handled as part of an ongoing search for a small boat that was overdue elsewhere. He called again, more directly. The available accounts put something like an hour and a half between the Fitzgerald's last transmission and the Coast Guard treating her as a missing 779-foot vessel with 29 people aboard. Nobody involved was incompetent. It is simply the ordinary friction of a busy night, a bad radio environment, and a report so implausible that it needed to be said twice. Then, the assets. And here the story arrives at the number everything so far has been building toward. The Coast Guard group responsible for that end of Lake Superior had no vessel able to operate in that sea. Not one. Their small craft would have been destroyed. The nearest capable Coast Guard surface unit was a 180-foot buoy tender at Duluth, at the far western end of the lake, roughly 300 miles away. She required about 2.5 hours simply to recall her crew and get underway, and then she had to steam the length of Lake Superior into the same storm. She arrived the following day. Set that against the map. The largest freighter loss in modern Great Lakes history occurred 17 miles from a sheltered bay, in a country with one of the best resourced coast guards in the world, and the nearest ship the government could send was a day away. So the Coast Guard did the only thing available. It asked the merchant fleet to do the rescue. They asked Captain Cooper to turn the Anderson around. Consider what that request actually was. The Anderson had just survived the same storm that had, in all likelihood, destroyed the ship ahead of her. She was minutes from the shelter of Whitefish Bay. Her crew had spent an entire day and night in it, and the request was to take a 767-foot loaded ore carrier, turn her broadside to 25 to 35-foot seas in order to come about, and steam back northwest into 70-knot winds in darkness to search an area of open water for men who, if they were in that water, had been in it for hours at a temperature that kills in minutes. Cooper turned around. His crew were reportedly not happy about it, which is not cowardice, it is arithmetic. They went anyway. Other ships were asked. A Canadian vessel started out from the bay and turned back because conditions were beyond what she could handle, which is a legitimate decision and worth stating plainly, because rescue is not a moral test, and a second wreck helps nobody. Several saltwater ships sheltering in the bay declined, and one more Laker, the William Clay Ford, got underway from the shelter of Whitefish Bay and went out into it, which meant deliberately leaving safety in a storm that had already killed a ship on the chance that someone was alive out there. Aircraft came, and they came reasonably fast. A fixed-wing HU-16 was over the area at 10:53 that night. A helicopter reached it at 1 in the morning and worked a searchlight across black water in blowing snow. And then, the last step in the chain, the one that no amount of speed can fix: approach and transfer. Suppose the helicopter had found a man in a life jacket at midnight. He had been in 4-degree water since roughly 7:20. His hands stopped working before 8. He could not have caught a line, could not have climbed into a basket, could not have held on to anything lowered to him. A rescue swimmer would have had to go into that water in those seas to physically attach him. The window for that had closed a long time before anyone reached the position. They searched through the night and for days afterward. What they found was debris. 2 lifeboats, one of them badly broken. Inflatable life rafts, of the kind designed to float free and self-inflate when a ship goes under, which is exactly what they had done. Life jackets, oars, wooden fenders, small items from the deck and the accommodation. What they did not find was any sign that anyone had tried to leave the ship. The lifeboats had not been launched. They had been torn from their chocks. Nobody had gone to a boat station. Nobody had put on a survival suit and gone over the side. Nobody had sent a distress call, and both the ship's radios were functional as of the last transmission, and the last transmission was 5 words indicating that the situation, while bad, was under control. That combination, in every serious analysis since, points to one conclusion and only one. Whatever ended, the Edmund Fitzgerald happened faster than a man can cross a wheelhouse and pick up a microphone. Not minutes, seconds, or a very small number of them. They did not find a single body. 29 men. And the lake kept all of them, for the reason you already know, which is that below the thermocline, the water sits near 4 degrees Celsius, and the biological process that would ordinarily return a body to the surface effectively does not run. On November 14th, a Navy P-3 Orion flying a magnetic anomaly detector picked up a strong contact northwest of Whitefish Point. Side-scan sonar from the Coast Guard confirmed a large wreck. The following spring, an unmanned submersible went down and spent days photographing and filming it. She sits in roughly 530 feet of water, in Canadian territory, roughly 17 miles from Whitefish Point. She is in 2 pieces. The bow section, about 276 feet of it, sits upright on the bottom, buried in the mud up to the waterline mark, looking from some angles like a ship still underway. The stern section, roughly 253 feet, lies capsized, upside down and canted over, about 170 feet from the bow in the Coast Guard's original survey, and further than that in later ones. Between them is a field of wreckage and a mound of taconite pellets spilled out of a hull that no longer exists as a continuous object. The name is still readable on her. She is the largest ship ever to sink in Lake Superior. That configuration launched an argument that has now been running for 50 years, and the argument is not academic. What broke her, and when, determines whether the ships still sailing that route are safe. The Coast Guard convened a Marine Board of Investigation, and its report concluded that the probable cause was loss of buoyancy and stability from massive flooding of the cargo hold, and that the water most likely entered through hatch closures that were not effective. The hatch system on a ship like the Fitzgerald was not the tarpaulin and wooden batten arrangement that the Henry B. Smith's crew were still wrestling with in 1913. It was a one-piece steel cover lowered onto a raised coaming and secured by a row of manually set clamps around the edge, on the order of 68 clamps per hatch, with 21 hatches. Every one of those clamps has to be knocked down by hand to make the seal work, and everyone has to be knocked off again by hand before the cargo can be unloaded. Thousands of manual operations per round trip, performed by deckhands, in weather, on a schedule. Coast Guard inspectors examining sister vessels, and the fleet's practices afterward found what anyone with any experience of industrial reality would expect. Clamps bent, clamps worn, clamps missing, and a working culture in which not every clamp was always set, particularly on a route where the ship was going to be unloaded in a matter of hours anyway. Then the investigators looked at the wreck. Along the coaming of the number 5 hatch, they counted 16 clamps in a row. The first and the 8th were distorted or broken. The other 14 were undamaged, and every one of the 14 was standing in the open position. The board's reconstruction went like this. Seas breaking over that low freeboard deck all afternoon forced water past imperfect hatch seals. It went into the cargo hold, where it was invisible. A hold full of taconite pellets does not show you a water level. There is no gauge that tells the master how many tons of lake are sitting in the bottom of his cargo. The ship slowly settled deeper, which put the deck lower, which let more water aboard, which accelerated everything. By evening, she had lost enough freeboard that she was riding low and heavy, and then she took a sea, or a pair of them, and drove her bow into the water and did not come back up. The National Transportation Safety Board reviewed it and largely agreed, concluding that the sinking followed sudden massive flooding of the cargo hold, most likely through the collapse of one or more hatch covers. One board member dissented and argued that the ship had struck bottom near Caribou Island earlier in the day. That dissent had powerful company. The Lake Carriers Association, representing the owners and operators, formally rejected the hatch cover conclusion. Their position was that these ships had been running with those hatch systems for decades in exactly these conditions, that the fleet's ordinary experience did not support the idea that hatch leakage could sink a vessel of that size, and that the far more likely explanation was that the Fitzgerald grounded on shallow ground north of Caribou Island, the same shoal that Captain Cooper had watched her pass close to, tore her bottom, and flooded from below. Look at the evidence honestly, and you will see why this cannot be settled. For the shoal theory, Cooper's radar observation, and his contemporaneous concern. The timing, since McSorley reported damage and a list not long after passing that area. The fact that survey work later showed shallow ground extending further east than the 1975 charts indicated. And the simple logic that a fence rail, 2 vents, and a list is a strange combination of damage to get purely from water on deck. Against it, the submersible survey found no clearly identifiable grounding damage where the hull could be seen. But the bottom of the bow section is buried in mud, and the stern is upside down. So the parts of the ship that would carry that evidence are precisely the parts nobody can examine. For the hatch theory, the physical inspection findings on clamps across the fleet, the low freeboard permitted by the amended load line rules, and the fact that a slow, invisible flooding of the cargo hold explains a ship that reports a list at 3:30 and is gone by 7:20 without anyone aboard believing the situation is terminal. Against it, 50 years of operators insisting that leaking hatches do not sink 729-foot ships, and no direct evidence of a collapsed cover, because the middle of the ship, where the hatches were, is the part that is shattered. Then there are the other candidates. A rogue sea, the coincidence of wave crests producing a group far larger than the surrounding water, of the kind Cooper described passing his own ship in the direction of the Fitzgerald. Structural failure, the hull simply breaking under the hogging and sagging cycle that this lake imposes on long ships, aggravated by a hold with tons of water sloshing in it. And here is the fact that quietly disposes of one whole branch of the argument. The bottom out there is about 530 feet down. The ship was 729 feet long. If she went down bow first, her bow reached the bottom, while more than 200 feet of her was still above the surface. There is no version of that event in which the hull survives intact. She would have broken on impact whether or not she broke before it, and that is essentially what the National Transportation Safety Board concluded, that the vessel sank in one piece and came apart either when it struck bottom or on the way down. Which means the 2 pieces on the bottom, the thing everyone points at, cannot by themselves tell you what happened at the surface. The most photographed evidence in this case is the evidence least able to answer the question. The one thing that every theory agrees on is the speed. No distress call, no lifeboat launched, no man at a boat station, and a final transmission indicating a ship that was struggling but functioning. Whatever the initiating cause was, the end took seconds. A ship with a cargo hold full of water and a bow that goes under a sea and keeps going does not sink the way films show. There is no long list, no slow settling, no time to reach a radio. There is a deck angle that becomes impossible, and then there is water. So the loop that has been open since the first 60 seconds of this story closes here, and it closes on a genuinely unsatisfying answer, which is the honest one. The Fitzgerald never called for help because there was no interval in which calling was possible. The reason we know almost nothing about the last minute of that ship is not that evidence was lost. It is that the last minute was too short to generate any. The second open loop closes here too. It has been hiding in plain sight. Why is the only shelter on that end of the lake also the shallowest water? Because they are the same geological fact. Whitefish Bay is the corner where Lake Superior drains. The lake narrows there, the two shorelines converge, and the bottom rises toward the outlet at the St. Mary's River. That convergence is exactly what makes it a lee, land on two sides blocking the wind, and the rising bottom is exactly what makes it shallow. You cannot have one without the other. Lay the wave physics back on top of that. A wave running into shallowing water slows, shortens, steepens, and eventually breaks. So a ship running downwind toward Whitefish Bay in a northwest gale is not running out of the storm. She is running into the part of the lake where the same storm produces its steepest, most punishing, most likely to break water, and she is doing it with the sea behind her, which is the hardest condition to steer in, because a following sea lifts the stern, pushes the bow down, and reduces the rudder's grip just when it is needed most. The Fitzgerald did not sink out in the middle. She sank 17 miles from shelter, in the approach, in the shallowing water, on the last leg. The refuge and the killing ground are the same place, and every ore carrier that has ever run for Whitefish Bay in a gale has had to cross the second to reach the first. The changes that followed were real, and they were not trivial. Survival suits, insulated full-body immersion suits that buy a person a chance of surviving longer than a few minutes in that water, became required equipment. Emergency position beacons that float free and transmit a location without anyone having to reach a radio became standard. Hatch clamp inspection requirements were tightened and enforcement changed. The shoal ground near Caribou Island was resurveyed and the charts corrected. Weather buoys were deployed on the lake itself, so forecasters stopped inferring the sea state from shoreline stations and started measuring it where the ships actually are. Ask the hard question about that list, though. Does any of it change the system? Survival suits and beacons do not stop a ship from sinking. They address the aftermath, and on a lake where the fatal event took seconds, an item of equipment stowed in a cabin is only useful to a crew that gets warning. Corrected charts prevent one specific grounding. Better buoys and forecasts improve the information a master has, and in the eastern end of that lake in a northwest gale, better information still leads to the same conclusion. Run for Whitefish Bay, because there is nowhere else. The mechanism was never fixed. It could not be fixed. It is made of geology. What changed instead is that the ships mostly stopped sinking, and that is where this story becomes something other than a history. Half a century has passed since 1975, and nothing remotely like it has happened again on these lakes. That record is not luck, and it deserves to be said out loud, because a documentary about disaster can easily leave the impression that nothing improved. An enormous amount improved. Modern lakers carry satellite weather, real-time wave models, and continuous position reporting. Every commercial vessel broadcasts its identity, course, and speed constantly on an automatic system, which means that if a ship stops moving, someone knows within minutes, rather than within an hour and a half of a puzzled first mate calling on the radio. Hull inspection is more rigorous, hatch maintenance is genuinely enforced, and the operational culture changed. The fleet holds in port for weather that in 1913 or 1975 would have been treated as a scheduling inconvenience. Ships sit at anchor in Whitefish Bay, and behind the Quinaw for a day at a time, and nobody's job is threatened for it. There is one more thing, the least romantic item on the list and probably the most effective. Consolidation. There are far fewer companies, far fewer hulls, and far more institutional memory concentrated in each of them. The Fitzgerald is not an abstraction to the people running those ships. It is the reason for a paragraph in their own operating manual. So the mechanism has been contained. Contained is not eliminated. And the difference between those two words is where the rest of this story lives. Start with what the shipping fleet still cannot do. A modern 1,000-foot carrier is 271 feet longer than the Edmund Fitzgerald. Everything you now understand about long hulls and short waves applies to her more, not less. She still straddles multiple crests in a superior gale. She still cycles between hogging and sagging every 8 to 10 seconds. She still has to reach the same funnel at Sault Ste. Marie, through the same shallowing corner, because there is still nowhere else for a loaded vessel to go on that end of the lake. Nobody has built a harbor of refuge in the eastern half of Lake Superior, and nobody is going to, because the shoreline geology does not offer a place to put one. Now look at rescue honestly in the present tense. The Coast Guard's primary air station for the entire Great Lakes Basin is at Traverse City, Michigan, on Lake Michigan. It is an excellent unit with capable helicopters. It is also several hundred miles from the middle of Lake Superior. Add the time to spin up a crew, the transit, the search pattern, and the fuel arithmetic that limits how long an aircraft can stay on scene at that range, and the response time to a person in the water in the middle of that lake is measured in hours. There are small boat stations around the American shore, at Duluth, Bayfield, the Portage Canal, Marquette, and the Sioux, and the 47-foot motor lifeboats they operate are extraordinary machines. They are self-righting, they are built to work in breaking surf, and the crews train specifically to go out in weather that sends everything else in. But a 47-foot boat crossing 40 miles of gale-driven Superior Sea to reach a casualty is going to take several hours to get there, if she can be launched at all. And you already know what the person in the water has. Somewhere between 1 minute and 10 before their hands stop working, and well under an hour before consciousness goes. That gap between a response measured in hours and a survival window measured in minutes is the same gap that existed at Duluth in 1905 when 10,000 people stood on a beach 700 feet from 9 dying men. Every technology named so far has narrowed the time it takes to learn that someone is in trouble. Almost none of it has narrowed the time it takes to physically reach them. Recognition got faster by a factor of 100. Arrival did not. Which means that the only reason the death toll fell is that fewer people ended up in the water. Not that the lake became more forgiving. And now the lake is changing. In 2007, 2 researchers at the University of Minnesota Duluth, Jay Austin and Stephen Coleman, published an analysis of Lake Superior's summer surface temperatures using several decades of buoy and satellite records. What they found was not a small trend. Summer surface water temperature had risen by roughly 2.5 degrees Celsius since 1979, and it had risen faster than the air temperature above it over the same period. That last part is the strange part, and it needs explaining, because water warming faster than the air over it sounds impossible. The mechanism is ice. Superior is a deep, cold lake, and its seasonal behavior is governed by when it stratifies, meaning when the surface layer warms enough to float on top of the cold water beneath and stop mixing with it. That moment depends on how much winter ice there was and how late it lasted. Ice reflects sunlight. Open water absorbs it. When the winter produces less ice and the ice goes out earlier, the lake starts absorbing solar energy earlier in the spring, stratifies earlier, and then spends a longer summer heating a thin surface layer instead of stirring that heat down into 1 to 300 feet of cold water. Warmer water in autumn means less ice the following winter, which means an even earlier start the next spring. The loop reinforces itself. Lake Superior's winter ice cover has trended downward over the same decades, with enormous variation from year to year. Some winters still freeze the lake almost completely. Others leave most of it open all winter long. Now connect that to everything this story has established, because this is where it stops being a climate statistic and becomes a wave. Ice is a wave killer. It is the single most effective damper this lake has ever had. A surface covered in ice, even broken and partial ice, cannot transfer wind energy into waves efficiently. The fetch is physically interrupted. A December gale over an ice-covered Superior produces slush, noise, and pressure ridges. The same gale over open water produces a fully developed sea with 300 miles of runway. So less ice does not mean a calmer lake. It means the wave-building season now extends deeper into the winter and starts earlier in the spring. The exact weeks that used to be closed by ice, the weeks when this lake historically shut down and stopped killing people, because nobody could be out there, are increasingly open water with storms crossing them. Say that plainly, because the intuitive reading is exactly backwards. A warmer Lake Superior is not a safer Lake Superior. A warmer Lake Superior is a lake with more open water available to the wind for more of the year, and warmer surface water feeding more energy into the storms that cross it, in a basin whose geometry has not changed at all. There is a second consequence that shows up on land. Shore-fast ice, the frozen apron that builds along beaches and rock shelves in winter, armors the coastline. It absorbs the impact of winter waves before they reach the shore itself. Where that ice fails to form, winter storms hit unprotected rock, sand, bluff, road, and building. Shoreline erosion on the Great Lakes has become a serious and expensive problem, and much of it is a direct product of waves arriving at coastlines that no longer have their winter armor. And the people. There are more of them on that shoreline than there have ever been, and their relationship with the lake is completely different from that of the crews in these wrecks. Nobody sails an oarboat for fun, but people drive hours to stand on Superior's rocks in a November gale, because a gale on that lake is one of the most spectacular things in North America. There are photographers on the breakwaters at Marquette and Duluth in every storm. There are kayakers on it in October. There is a genuine surfing culture on Lake Superior now. People who watch the wave models the way the freighter captains do and drive to the North Shore specifically because a storm is coming, and who paddle out into 4-degree fresh water with 300 miles of fetch behind it. The lake did not become less dangerous. The population exposed to it simply changed occupations, which is why the storm that produced the largest waves ever measured on this lake killed nobody at sea, and killed 2 people standing on rock. On October 24, 2017, a deep low crossed the upper Great Lakes and put a hard northwest wind down the full length of Lake Superior. Everything in the first half of this story assembled itself again. The storm track, the long axis, the fetch, the short, steep freshwater sea. The only difference was that this time there were instruments in the water. There is now a network of moored buoys on the lake, operated by federal and university programs, sitting out in the open water and reporting wind, air, and water temperature, wave height, and wave period every 20 or 30 minutes. They exist because of everything you have just read. After 1975, it became indefensible to forecast a sea state for one of the busiest inland shipping routes on the continent by guessing from shoreline anemometers. That day, the buoy near Granite Island, off the south shore above Marquette, recorded a significant wave height of 28.8 feet. Another buoy in the same stretch of lake reported nearly the same figure. It was the highest wave height ever measured on Lake Superior, beating 27.6 feet, recorded by a Michigan Tech buoy near Houghton in 2012. Now, significant wave height is a term that gets quoted constantly and understood almost never, and the misunderstanding runs in the wrong direction, so it matters here. Significant wave height is not the height of the biggest wave. It is the average height of the highest 1/3 of the waves in the measurement period. It is a statistical description of a sea, chosen historically because it corresponds roughly to what an experienced observer will report by eye. In any given sea, individual waves are distributed around that value, and over a few hours, the largest single wave you should statistically expect is close to twice the significant height. So a significant wave height of 28.8 feet does not describe a lake with 28-foot waves on it. It describes a lake where the average of the biggest third was 28.8 feet, and where individual crests in the 40s, and possibly higher, were a normal statistical consequence of that sea. Not rogue, not anomalous, expected. That is the order of magnitude the Fitzgerald's crew were working in. And the crews of 1905 and 1913 and 1927 before them. And until 2017, nobody had ever put a measured number on the top end of it. And even then, that number is not the top of this lake. A buoy reports what passes over the buoy. There were 2 of them in that stretch of water, and hundreds of square miles of open lake around them, with nothing recording at all. The same storm drove a wind reading of 107 miles an hour at one station that the forecasters themselves suspected was an instrument error, which is what tends to happen to equipment out there at the top of the scale, which produces a genuinely uncomfortable conclusion, and it is the last mechanical insight this lake has to offer. The record of 28.8 feet is not the largest wave Lake Superior produces. It is the largest wave Lake Superior has produced at a moment when a working instrument happened to be sitting directly underneath it. That is not a survey of a lake. That is a survey of 2 points on it. The published record here is not an upper bound. It is a floor. There is a second and even larger blind spot in that record, and it comes straight out of the ice. Those buoys are seasonal. They are pulled out of the water each autumn before the lake begins to freeze, because a moored buoy left in a lake with moving ice is a buoy that gets destroyed or dragged. Deployment and recovery dates vary, but the practical result is that the instruments are typically out of the water for the depths of winter. So for almost the entire history of that network, the storms of December, January, and February went unmeasured in the stretch of the year when the waves are biggest. That has only just started to change. Michigan Tech and its partners have begun leaving small, lightweight wave buoys out through the winter, dropped at mid-lake as the big ice-vulnerable platforms are pulled, precisely because the season nobody could measure is the season that matters most. Those are the storms that in a lake with declining ice cover increasingly fall on open water with the full 300-mile fetch available to them. So when someone tells you the record wave on Lake Superior is 28.8 feet, the accurate translation is this: that is the biggest one we have caught. At 2 points on an inland sea, in the months we are willing to leave equipment out there. The storm of October 2017 did not sink a ship. The fleet knew it was coming, and the fleet stayed put or stayed out of the worst of it, exactly as it should have, which should have made this a story with no casualties. It was not. At about 25 to 2 in the afternoon, at a place called Black Rocks in Presque Isle Park on the edge of Marquette, a man and a woman from Iron River, 53 Fries and 37 years old, were swept off the rock and into the lake. A small crowd had come out to watch the waves. The record measurement had been logged that morning, hours before, and by early afternoon the lake along that shore was still running around 25 feet. So count the rescue one more time with a modern clock on it. The Coast Guard had the case by 2 o'clock. The helicopter came from Air Station Traverse City on Lake Michigan, and it was over the water at 4:14 in the afternoon. 2 hours and 39 minutes from the moment they went in. You already know what 4-degree water does in 2 hours and 39 minutes. It has finished doing it inside the first 10 minutes. The search was suspended at 9:20 that night, in 25-foot seas and 40-mile-an-hour winds, because it was no longer safe for the people doing the searching, which is the same sentence the tug captains heard at Isle Royale in December 1927, and the same sentence that ended the night at Duluth in 1905. The man's body was recovered about a month later. The woman was never found. Here is why the shoreline is where the danger relocated. The physics are not the same as the physics offshore, and the difference is what fools people. A large wave in deep water is a long, smooth rise and fall. It is not dangerous to look at from a boat if the boat is sound. Bring that same wave into shallow water at a rocky coast, and it does what shallow water always does. It slows, shortens, steepens, and releases its energy over a very short distance. against a vertical or near vertical rock face, part of that energy reflects straight back out, and the incoming and reflecting water can stack into a surge that climbs far higher up the rock than the wave height alone would suggest. A shelf that sits 15 feet above the still water can be swept by a sea whose crests are nowhere near 15 feet tall. Then there is the grouping, which is the actual trap. Waves in a storm sea do not arrive at even heights. They arrive in groups, and between groups there are lulls. Someone standing on rock watches for a while, sees the water reach a certain line repeatedly, decides where the safe boundary is, and steps forward to that boundary. Their measurement is honest. It is also based on a sample that did not include the largest group, which may be several minutes away. And here is what happens if that group takes you off the rock. You go into water near 4 degrees Celsius, the gasp reflex fires immediately, and you are in breaking surf when it does. Within a couple of minutes, your hands are unreliable. The same waves that removed you from the shelf are now driving you back against it, and rock covered in a season's growth is not something you can grip in that state anyway. There is no beach to be carried onto. Anyone who goes in after you is entering the identical situation with the identical clock. The nearest rescue crew, however good, is minutes away at best, and usually more. And the entire margin has already been spent. That is the modern shape of this system, and the reason none of this ends with a wreck. Freighter losses collapsed because the industry learned, regulated, consolidated, and got much better information. Nobody regulated the shoreline. The number of people standing on it during storms went up. The ice that used to keep them off it and armor it goes missing more often, and the waves reaching it are getting a longer season to build in. The deaths moved off the deck and onto the rocks. The mechanism did not change at all. Cold water, short, steep waves, shallow ground, and a rescue clock that runs slower than a human body. Go back to Isle Royale for a moment, because it answers the question of whether any of this is actually historical. Isle Royale is a national park now, the least visited national park in the contiguous United States, partly because getting there requires a boat or a float plane across open Lake Superior. The park closes, not metaphorically. The whole island shuts to visitors from the beginning of November until the middle of April. No ferries, no seaplanes on a schedule, no rangers on station in the way they are in July, no stores, no fuel, no medical facility, and over most of the island, no reliable means of calling anyone. Which means that if you put a boat on the rocks at Isle Royale in December of this year, your situation is structurally identical to the situation of the Kamloops crew in December 1927. You may reach land. The land will be empty. The lake between you and help will be in the state it is always in at that time of year. Too rough and too cold for a small vessel, and not solid enough to walk on. The nearest Coast Guard air asset is hours away, and it has to be told you exist first. A century of technology, and the specific trap that killed 22 people on that island is exactly where they left it. The waters around Isle Royale hold 10 major wrecks, and several of them lie in depths that put them at the edge of what divers can safely do. People die on those wrecks with some regularity, which is its own quiet commentary. The cold that preserved the Kamloops so perfectly is the same cold that shortens a diver's decision-making at 200 feet. And the isolation that killed her crew is the same isolation that means a diving accident there is not a 15-minute helicopter ride from a decompression chamber. Now go back to the calendar, because that has not moved either. The locks at Sault Ste. Marie still close for the winter, generally in mid-January, and reopen in late March. Every ton of iron ore, grain, cement, and salt that has to leave Lake Superior by water has to be through that gate before it shuts, which means the modern shipping season still ends the way it always ended, with a run of final trips, in the coldest and darkest weeks, when the water is at its most lethal, and the shore stations and buoys are at their thinnest. The traffic still converges. Every loaded vessel leaving Lake Superior, including the 1,000-footers, has to pass down through Whitefish Bay into the St. Mary's River and through the lock chambers at the Soo. There is no alternative route. There is no second exit. The funnel that put the Fitzgerald and the Anderson on the same course into the same shallowing corner on the same night in November 1975 is the identical funnel that every ship in that fleet uses today, in the same weather, in the same months. What has changed is that the modern masters have better information and, crucially, permission to use it. That is the real safety improvement. And it is cultural rather than technical. A captain today who says he is not leaving Duluth until Thursday because Wednesday's low is going to put 25-foot seas across his route will not be threatened, will not be replaced, and will not lose the trip. That single change in what a company will tolerate has probably saved more lives on this lake than radar, radio, and satellites combined. It is also the change that is easiest to lose. It is not built into the rock or the steel. It is a habit, maintained by an industry that remembers 1975, staffed increasingly by people who were not alive for it. The Edmund Fitzgerald has had a strange afterlife, and the details of it matter to what that wreck means now. In the 1990s, a series of expeditions went down to her with submersibles. One of them, in 1994, recorded what appeared to be the remains of a crew member on the bottom near the bow, partly dressed in coveralls and wearing a life jacket. Nothing was recovered. That single observation, more than any sonar image, is what convinced a lot of people that the wreck was not a historical site, but a grave. On the 4th of July, 1995, at the request of family members of the crew, a Canadian and American expedition led by Joseph McInnes went down and lifted the ship's 200-pound bronze bell off the top of the pilot house. Using an armored, one-man diving suit. They did not take it and leave a hole. They lowered a replacement bell, engraved with the names of the 29 men, and secured it in place on the wreck. The recovered bell was restored and put on display at the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, which sits on the same piece of land as the lighthouse whose beacon was out of service on the night she was lost. At the mouth of the bay she never reached, roughly 17 miles from where she lies. Ontario later closed the site. The wreck lies in Canadian water. The families asked for her to be left alone. And since 2006, there has been a 500-meter ring around the hull, inside which diving, submersibles, sonar, and cameras all require a license, with a fine of up to $1 million for anyone who goes in without one. That is the whole system in one object, a bell taken off the bottom of a lake that keeps almost everything, sitting in a building on the shore of the only shelter for 100 miles, at the shallow end, where the water is most dangerous, precisely because it is the way to safety. Every year, on the 10th of November, there is a ceremony at Whitefish Point. The bell is rung 29 times, once for each of the men aboard, and then a 30th time for everyone else this lake has taken. The 30th ring is not sentimentality. The Great Lakes Shipwreck. Historical Society's own count of wrecks in these waters runs to the hundreds, and the total number of people lost on Lake Superior since the beginning of European shipping is not precisely known, because for most of that history, nobody was keeping a complete list, and because a lake that returns almost none of its dead does not generate reliable records. So what is the honest verdict? Lake Superior is not the deadliest body of water on Earth, and anybody who tells you it is has not counted. The oceans kill far more people every year, and there are stretches of coastline elsewhere with worse records over shorter periods. What Lake Superior has is a specific and unusually complete machine for turning ordinary commercial work into fatal outcomes, and the parts of that machine are all measurable. It starts with a trench in the continent that happens to be aligned with the autumn wind. And that alignment sets a maximum fetch of about 300 miles. Fetch sets the size of the sea. But because the lake ends before the waves can mature, the period stays short, around 8 to 10 seconds. And short period means short wavelength. And short wavelength against a 500 or 700 or 1,000 foot hull means the ship spans multiple crests and gets worked through hogging and sagging cycles thousands of times in a single night. Length on this lake is a structural liability rather than a form of safety. That is the first machine, and it is entirely a product of geometry. The second machine is temperature. 4 degrees Celsius below the surface layer year-round in a basin too deep and too large for the sun to change. That number sets the survival clock. A gasp reflex in seconds, useless hands in minutes, unconsciousness well inside an hour. It also sets the recovery record, because at that temperature, the biology that returns a body to the surface effectively stops, which is why so many of the people in these wrecks were never found, and why the ones who were found were often found by accident months later on a beach. The third machine is the absence of shelter. One mid-lake lee behind the Keweenaw. One real refuge on the eastern half at Whitefish Bay, which is the shallow corner where the lake drains, which means the approach to safety is the water where waves shorten, steepen, and break. There is no version of this lake in which the refuge is deep, because the same convergence of shorelines that blocks the wind is the same convergence that raises the bottom. The fourth machine is not physical at all. It is the calendar. Ice closes the exit for roughly 10 weeks a year, so the year's remaining cargo has to move in the weeks when the storms are worst, which puts the heaviest, latest, most valuable trips into the most dangerous water on the schedule. The pressure does not need a villain. Frozen ore in a dock pocket at Marquette in 1913 and a mill order for taconite at Zug Island in 1975 apply the same force through completely different mechanisms. The fifth machine is rescue distance. It has changed least of all. Life-saving stations with a pulling boat's reach of a few miles along 2,700 miles of shoreline. Seasonal crews that went home before the worst weather arrived. A Coast Guard tender 300 miles away on the night of the largest loss. An air station on a different lake today. The chain from recognition to authorization to preparation, to transit to search, to approach to transfer has been shortened at the front and barely shortened at the back, and the back is where the body is. Trace technology through that system, and you find that it never removed a single machine. It moved the boundary. Steam removed the requirement to wait for wind, which removed the enforced withdrawal that had governed travel on this water for centuries. Lights and charts fixed position, which let ships run closer to shore at night. Radio meant a vessel could be missed within an hour instead of a week. Radar meant snow stopped being a reason to stay in port. Bigger hulls carried more cargo across more waves at once. Amended load line rules let those hulls sit 3 feet deeper, converting reserve buoyancy directly into tonnage. Season extension pushed traffic into January. Every one of those was an improvement in capability, and every one of them was spent, in whole or in part, on doing more, rather than on holding more margin. That is not an argument against technology. It is a description of how organizations actually use it. The only intervention in this entire history that reduced deaths without being immediately spent on expanded operations was the cultural decision, made after 1975, that a captain is allowed to say no. And the lake is now changing underneath all of it. Less ice in more winters means less damping, longer open water, and a fetch that stays available in the months nobody measures. Warmer surface water in autumn means more energy available to the storms that cross it. The shoreline loses the ice apron that used to absorb winter waves, and the erosion shows up in road closures and collapsed bluffs. And the people who are exposed are no longer mostly crews. They are photographers on breakwaters, kayakers in October, surfers who drive north because a gale is forecast, and families standing on wet rock to watch something genuinely magnificent happen 20 feet away. The mechanism does not care which of those you are. Cold water, steep waves, shallow ground, a clock that runs faster than help can arrive. So here's where it leaves you, late November at Whitefish Point. The lighthouse is there, white in the gray, and the museum behind it holds a bronze bell that was lifted off a pilot house 530 feet down and 17 miles out. On the 10th, the bell is rung 29 times, slowly, one for each man, and then once more. Families come. Some of them are now the children and grandchildren of people they never met. The sound does not carry far outside the building because the wind takes it. Out past the point, the traffic is running. In a west-northwest blow, the ships come down the length of the lake with the sea behind them and turn in around the point in the dark, one after another. Their lights showing and then swinging as they come around, and every one of them is steering for the same corner of shallow water, because in 100 miles of that coast, there is nowhere else to go. Ice is beginning to show on the rails. The locks close in January. The last cargoes of the year are still out on the lake. They will keep coming around that point for as long as there is ore to move, and the water they are running into will keep being the most dangerous water on that shore. For exactly the same reason, it is the only shelter.